If you enjoy my stories, please subscribe and hit the like button. I'd really appreciate it. Leave a comment telling me which city you're from and what time it is there. I'm curious to know where my favorite subscribers are from, and share the scariest story that ever happened to you. I'll pin the best one under the video forever. I've always believed that cameras capture more than what the human eye can see, not in some mystical, supernatural sense, but in the technical way that lenses gather light differently than our retinas. That digital sensors pick up frequencies our brains filter out. It's why photographs sometimes reveal details we missed in the moment. A bird in flight, expression caught between poses, the way shadows fall at just the right angle. I believed this right up until that weekend at Meredith's family cabin on Lake Mendota. Now I know that cameras don't just capture more than we see. Sometimes they capture things we should never see at all. My name is David Chen, and I'm 26 years old. I work as a freelance photographer in Madison, which is probably why I was the one taking most of the pictures that weekend. It was supposed to be a reunion of sorts. 7 of us from college getting together for the first time since graduation 3 years ago. Meredith had inherited her grandmother's cabin and thought it would be perfect for a laid-back weekend away from the city. The cabin sat on a small inlet of Lake Mendota, surrounded by dense Wisconsin woodland that stretched for miles in every direction. It was the kind of place that looked like it belonged on a postcard. Weathered cedar siding, a wraparound porch, a stone chimney that spoke of cozy winter nights by the fire. The nearest neighbor was probably 2 miles away, which gave us the privacy to be as loud and ridiculous as we wanted. Our group consisted of myself, Meredith Williams, who owned the cabin, Leah Morrison, who'd been my roommate junior year, Trevor Kowalski and his girlfriend, Sarah Beth Patterson, and finally Chris Holland and Jamie Rodriguez, who'd been dating since sophomore year. We'd all stayed in touch through social media and the occasional group text, but this was the first time we'd all been in the same place since graduation. We arrived on Friday evening, just as the summer sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. The air was warm and humid, filled with the sounds of insects and the gentle lapping of lake water against the dock. There's something about being near water that immediately relaxes people, and within an hour of arriving, we'd all slipped back into the easy camaraderie we'd shared in college. Meredith had planned everything perfectly. We spent the evening grilling burgers and corn on the cob on the cabin's back deck, drinking beer and catching up on the 3 years that had passed since we'd all been together. Trevor had brought his guitar, and after dinner, we moved down to the fire pit near the water's edge, where Chris got a nice blaze going while Jamie broke out a bottle of wine she'd been saving. "This is exactly what I needed," Leah said, settling into one of the Adirondack chairs arranged around the fire. "I've been so stressed with the bar exam prep that I forgot what it felt like to just breathe." "Tell me about it," Sarah Beth agreed. "Teaching middle school is basically like being in a war zone from August to June. This is the first time in months I've gone more than an hour without checking my email." As the fire crackled and Trevor strummed gentle melodies on his guitar, I found myself reaching for my camera out of habit. I'd brought my professional DSLR, but I also had my phone, and in the relaxed atmosphere, the phone seemed more appropriate, less formal, more spontaneous. "Oh God, David's in photographer mode," Chris laughed, noticing me adjusting my camera settings. "Remember junior year when he documented every single party like he was working for National Geographic?" "Hey, someone has to preserve these memories," I said, snapping a quick shot of Chris gesturing dramatically with his beer bottle. 20 years from now, you'll thank me for having pictures of when we were young and beautiful." "Speak for yourself," Jamie said. "I'm going to be young and beautiful forever." The laughter that followed was exactly the kind of moment I wanted to capture, so I held up my phone and called out, "Okay, everyone look this way for a second." They all turned toward me, faces illuminated by the flickering firelight, expressions ranging from genuine smiles to exaggerated poses. I snapped several quick shots, the camera's flash briefly turning night into day before fading back to the warm glow of the fire. "Let me see," Leah said, getting up from her chair and coming over to look at my phone screen. I swiped through the photos I'd just taken, and we all crowded around to see how they'd turned out. Phone cameras have gotten remarkably good in recent years, and even in the challenging light conditions, the shots were clear and well exposed. "That one's perfect," Meredith said, pointing to a shot where everyone was laughing at something Trevor had said. "Send that to the group chat." I was about to do exactly that when something in the background caught my eye. In the trees behind where everyone was sitting, just at the edge of where the firelight faded into darkness, there appeared to be a tall, dark shape. "Huh?" I said, zooming in on that section of the photo. "What's that back there?" The others leaned in closer, squinting at my phone screen. The shape was indistinct, could have been a tree trunk or a large bush, but there was something about its proportions that seemed off. It appeared to be roughly human-shaped, but much taller than any person should be. "Probably just a tree," Trevor said. "The camera flash can make shadows look weird." "Yeah, or maybe it's Bigfoot," Chris added with a grin. "Wouldn't that be something? Wisconsin's very own cryptid sighting." We all laughed, and I dismissed it as exactly what Trevor had suggested. Just a trick of light and shadow that had created an interesting but ultimately meaningless photographic artifact. I took several more pictures throughout the evening, capturing the relaxed atmosphere and genuine joy of being reunited with old friends. It wasn't until later, when we'd moved back up to the cabin and were sitting around the living room playing cards, that I noticed something strange about the photos I'd taken earlier. I was scrolling through my phone's photo gallery while the others debated the rules of some complicated drinking game when I stopped at the group shot from by the fire. The dark shape in the background was still there, but now that I was looking at it on the larger screen of my phone in better lighting, I could see more detail. It definitely wasn't a tree. The shape had the basic proportions of a human figure: head, torso, arms, legs, but everything was wrong. It was far too tall, probably 8 or 9 feet if I had to guess based on its size relative to the trees around it. The arms appeared to hang down almost to the ground, and there was something unsettling about the way it stood, perfectly motionless, like a statue that had been abandoned in the woods. But the most disturbing aspect was what should have been its face. Instead of features, there was just blurred, indistinct area that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Looking at it made my eyes water, as if My brain was trying to focus on something that couldn't be properly seen. "Hey," I said, interrupting the game discussion, "take a look at this photo again." I handed my phone to Leah, who was sitting next to me on the couch. She looked at the screen, and I watched her expression change from casual interest to confusion. "That's weird," she said slowly. "What is that thing?" The others gathered around to look, and soon everyone was staring at my phone with varying degrees of puzzlement and unease. "It's definitely not a tree," Meredith said. "But what could it be? And why didn't any of us notice it when we were sitting right there?" "Maybe it's some kind of camera glitch," Sarah Beth suggested. "You know how sometimes phone cameras pick up weird artifacts, especially in low light?" I wanted to believe that explanation, but something about the figure in the photo felt too deliberate, too purposeful to be a random technical error. Digital artifacts usually appeared as geometric shapes or color distortions, not as coherent, human-like forms. "Let me see the other photos from tonight," Jamie said. I swiped through the rest of the images I'd taken during the evening. Most of them showed nothing unusual, just normal shots of friends enjoying themselves around a campfire. But as I reached the photos taken near the end of our time by the fire pit, I found another image that made my blood run cold. It was a candid shot I'd taken of Leah while she was telling a story, gesturing animatedly with both hands. But standing directly behind her, just at the edge of the firelight's reach, was the same tall figure. It was closer now, close enough that I could make out more details of its impossible anatomy. The thing, and I was definitely thinking of it as a thing rather than a person now, appeared to be wearing dark clothing, but the fabric seemed to move in the still photograph, as if it were caught in a wind that affected nothing else in the frame. Its face remained that same disturbing blur of indistinct features, but I could now clearly see two dark voids where eyes should be. Not black eyes, but actual holes in the visual field, as if someone had taken an eraser to that part of the photograph. "Oh my God," Leah whispered, staring at the image of herself with the figure looming behind her. "It's standing right behind me." "How did nobody see that?" "Because it wasn't there," Trevor said firmly. "I was sitting right across from you the whole time. Why, there was nothing behind you except trees." "Then how do you explain the photo?" I asked. Trevor had no answer for that, and neither did anyone else. We spent the next hour examining every image on my phone, looking for more appearances of the mysterious figure. We found 2 more shots where it appeared, each time positioned behind Leah, and each time noticeably closer than in the previous photo. In the final image, taken just before we'd moved back to the cabin, the figure was standing close enough to Leah that it should have been touching her. The detail was clear enough now that I could see its arms were far too long for its body, ending in hands that seemed to have too many fingers. The dark clothing wasn't clothing at all, but appeared to be its actual skin, black and smooth, like burned plastic. "This is really freaking me out," Leah said, her voice shaking slightly. "Why is this thing in all the photos with me? And why can't I remember seeing it?" "Maybe we should delete these," Sarah Beth suggested. "I mean, they're obviously some kind of technical malfunction, right?" No point in keeping creepy, glitched photos. But I found myself reluctant to delete the images, despite how unsettling they were. As a photographer, I was trained to document unusual phenomena, not destroy evidence of them. Instead, I decided to back up all the photos to my cloud storage, just in case. "Let's just forget about it for tonight," Meredith said, sensing the mood had shifted from relaxed fun to anxious tension. "We're all tired, and things always seem less scary in the morning." We agreed to call it a night, but I could tell that everyone was more shaken than they wanted to admit. As we headed to our respective bedrooms, the cabin had 3 bedrooms, plus a pull-out couch in the living room. I noticed that Leah kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to see something following her. I was sharing the loft bedroom with Trevor and Chris, while the women had claimed the 2 downstairs bedrooms. As I lay in my sleeping bag staring up at the exposed wooden beams of the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about those photographs. The rational part of my mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation. Camera phones are complex pieces of technology, and they can malfunction in unexpected ways. Maybe the sensor had been damaged, or maybe there was some kind of software bug that was creating false images. But the more I thought about it, the less convinced I became by these explanations. The figure appeared consistently across multiple photos, taken at different times. It showed clear signs of progression, moving closer to Leah with each image. And most troubling of all, it seemed to be aware of the camera, always positioning itself just at the edge of the frame, as if it knew exactly how much of itself would be captured. I must have finally fallen asleep sometime after midnight, because the next thing I knew, I was being awakened by screaming. I bolted upright in my sleeping bag, immediately alert. The screaming was coming from downstairs, and I could hear multiple voices, panicked, frightened voices, calling Leah's name. Trevor and Chris were already climbing down from the loft as I struggled to get free of my sleeping bag. We rushed downstairs to find Meredith, Sarah Beth, and Jamie standing in the hallway outside the bedrooms, all looking terrified. "She's not here," Meredith said as soon as she saw us. "Leah's not in her room. Her bed hasn't been slept in. Maybe she went outside," Chris suggested. Couldn't sleep, decided to go for a walk." But even as he said it, we all knew that wasn't likely. Leah had been visibly upset by the photographs, and she wasn't the type of person to go wandering around alone in unfamiliar woods in the middle of the night. We spent the next hours searching the cabin and the immediate grounds. We called her name until our voices were hoarse, checked every room twice, looked in closets and under beds, like she might be hiding somewhere as part of some elaborate prank. But there was no sign of her anywhere. "Maybe she drove back to Madison," Sarah Beth suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "Got spooked and decided to leave without telling anyone." I checked the driveway. All our cars were still there, including Leah's silver Honda Civic. Her purse was still in her bedroom, along with her keys and phone. "We should call the police," Jamie said. "And tell them what?" Trevor asked. "That our friend disappeared from a locked cabin in the middle of the night without taking her car or phone or any of her belongings. They're going to think we did something to her." "Then what do you suggest?" Meredith snapped. "Just wait around and hope she shows up?" I had taken out my phone to call 911 when I noticed that I had several new photos in my gallery. Photos I didn't remember taking. "Guys," I said slowly, "look at this." The new photos showed our group from earlier that evening, sitting around the fire pit. But these weren't the same shots I'd taken before. These images had been captured from a different angle, as if someone had been standing in the woods watching us. And in every single photo, the tall, dark figure was clearly visible. It wasn't hiding at the edge of the frame anymore. It was standing directly behind Leah, close enough that its impossible height towered over her seated form. The detail was crisp and clear, showing every unsettling aspect of its anatomy. The two long arms, the smooth black skin, the void-like eyes in its blurred face. But in the final photo in the sequence, Leah was gone. The chair where she'd been sitting was empty, and the figure was standing in the exact spot where she had been. It wasn't positioned behind the chair. It was occupying the same space Leah had occupied, as if it had replaced her entirely. "What the hell is this?" Trevor demanded, grabbing my phone and staring at the screen. "When were these taken? And who took them?" I checked the timestamp on the photos. They had been captured at 3:17 a.m., just 20 minutes ago, but I had been asleep in the loft at that time, and my phone had been sitting on the nightstand next to my sleeping bag. "This is impossible," Chris said, looking over Trevor's shoulder at the photos. "Phones don't just take pictures by themselves." "Maybe someone's messing with us," Sarah Beth suggested, but her voice was shaking. "Maybe this is all some kind of sick joke." I wanted to believe that explanation, but it raised more questions than it answered. Who would go to such elaborate lengths to prank us? And how had they managed to take photos with my phone while I was sleeping just a few feet away from it? More importantly, where was Leah? We called the police. 2 officers from the Dane County Sheriff's Department arrived about an hour later, Deputy Martinez and Deputy Chen, no relation, despite the name. They were professional and thorough, taking our statements and examining the cabin for any signs of forced entry or struggle. I showed them the photographs on my phone, but I could tell they thought I was either lying or delusional. Digital images can be easily manipulated, and without any corroborating evidence, they had no reason to take the photos seriously. "Has Miss Morrison been under any unusual stress lately?" Deputy Martinez asked. "Relationship problems, financial difficulties, anything that might make her want to disappear for a while?" We all shook our heads. Leah had seemed stressed about the bar exam, but not to the point where she would vanish without a word to anyone. She was one of the most responsible people I knew, the type who would call if she was going to be 5 minutes late for anything. The deputies spent another hour searching the woods around the cabin with flashlights, but found no trace of Leah or any indication of what might have happened to her. They took copies of some of the photos from my phone and promised to file a missing person report, but I could tell they weren't optimistic about finding any answers. "People don't just vanish into thin air," Deputy Chen told us before they left. "If she doesn't turn up by this afternoon, we'll organize a more comprehensive search." But in cases like this, 9 times out of 10, the person chose to leave on their own. After the police departed, we sat around the cabin's living room in stunned silence. None of us knew what to do or say. Leah was gone, and the only clue we had was a series of impossible photographs that showed her being replaced by something that shouldn't exist. "I think we should leave," Jamie said finally. "Pack up and go home. This place, something's wrong here." "We can't just abandon Leah," Meredith protested. What if she comes back and we're not here? What if that thing comes for one of us next? Sarah Beth countered. It was Chris who noticed that my phone was making noise. David, he said quietly, your phone is taking pictures. I looked down at my phone, which was sitting on the coffee table where I'd left it. The screen was lighting up every few seconds, accompanied by the soft artificial shutter sound that indicated a photo being captured. But nobody was touching the phone, and the camera app wasn't even open. I picked up the phone and swiped to the camera roll. There were dozens of new photos, all taken within the last few minutes. They showed our group sitting in the living room from various angles, as if someone was walking around the room taking candid shots. But we were the only ones in the room. Turn it off, Trevor said urgently. Turn the damn thing off. I powered down the phone, but it continued taking pictures for several more seconds before the screen finally went dark. When I turned it back on a minute later, there were even more photos in the gallery. The most recent image showed our group huddled together on the couch, all looking terrified, and standing directly behind Trevor, close enough to touch his shoulder, was the tall, dark figure. It's moved on to you, Sarah Beth whispered, staring at Trevor's pale face. It's targeting you now. Trevor stood up abruptly, backing away from the rest of us, as if we were contaminated. This is insane, he said. Phones don't take pictures by themselves. People don't just disappear and get replaced by whatever that thing is supposed to be. But even as he spoke, I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew, just as we all knew, that something impossible was happening to us. What do we do? Meredith asked. I didn't have an answer. As a photographer, I was trained to document reality, not to deal with situations where reality itself seemed to be breaking down. But I knew we needed to understand what we were dealing with if we had any hope of surviving it. We need to test this, I said. Figure out the rules. When does it appear? What triggers it? Why is it targeting us? Are you out of your mind? Chris demanded. You want to experiment with the thing that made Leah disappear? If we don't understand it, we can't fight it, I replied. And right now, it's targeting Trevor. Do you want to wait around and see what happens to him? After a heated debate, we agreed to try a controlled experiment. We would take one photograph of our group and examine it immediately to see if the figure appeared. If it did, we would know that it was still active. If it didn't, maybe whatever was happening had stopped. I reluctantly powered my phone back on and opened the camera app. The others arranged themselves on the couch, sitting close together like they were posing for a family portrait. Trevor was noticeably pale and kept glancing over his shoulder, even though there was clearly nothing behind him. Okay, I said, holding up the phone. Everyone try to look normal. Just one quick shot. I tapped the shutter button, and the flash illuminated the room for a split second. The photo appeared on my screen immediately, and my heart sank as I saw what it contained. The figure was there, standing directly behind Trevor, just as it had been in the previous photos. But this time, there were details I hadn't noticed before. Its face, while still largely obscured and blurred, seemed to show the suggestion of a smile, and its long, impossible arms were reaching forward, as if it were about to place its hands on Trevor's shoulders. It's right behind you, I said quietly. Trevor spun around, but there was nothing there except the empty living room. This is impossible, he said, his voice rising with panic. I swear I can feel something behind me, but there's nothing there." "Maybe we should destroy the phone," Jamie suggested. "If it can't take pictures, maybe it can't affect us." But I was afraid that destroying the phone might make things worse. The photographs seemed to be the only way we could actually see the entity that was stalking us. Without them, we'd be blind to its presence. Instead, I suggested something else. "Let's try taking photos without people in them," I said. "See if it only appears when we're in the frame." I spent the next few minutes photographing different areas of the cabin. The empty kitchen, the fireplace, the windows overlooking the lake. Every image came out normal, showing nothing but ordinary furniture and fixtures. "It only appears in photos with people," I concluded, "and it seems to be drawn to specific individuals." "Great," Trevor said bitterly. "So I'm cursed because some invisible monster likes to photobomb pictures." We spent the rest of the morning trying to figure out what to do. Leaving seemed like the obvious choice, but we were all afraid of what might happen if we tried to drive away while the entity was still attached to Trevor. Would it follow us? Would it become more aggressive if we tried to escape? By noon, Trevor was becoming increasingly agitated. He kept insisting that he could feel something watching him, following him around the cabin. Every time I took a photo to check, the figure was indeed positioned behind him, always a little closer than in the previous image. "I can't take this anymore," he finally said. "I'm getting out of here." "Trevor, wait," Sarah Beth pleaded. "Don't go alone." But he was already heading for the door, keys in hand. "I'm driving back to Madison. Whatever this thing is, I'm not going to sit around waiting for it to do to me whatever it did to Leah." He made it as far as his car. I was watching from the front window when it happened. Trevor had just opened the driver's side door when he suddenly stopped moving. He stood there for a moment, perfectly still, then slowly turned around to face the cabin. Even from a distance, I could see that something was wrong with his face. It was blurred, indistinct, like a photograph taken with a shaky camera. And his eyes. His eyes were just dark voids. "Oh, God," Sarah Beth whispered from beside me. "That's not Trevor anymore." The thing that had been Trevor raised one too long arm and waved at us before getting into the car and driving away. We watched the taillights disappear around the curve in the driveway, taking with them any hope that this nightmare might have a rational explanation. I checked my phone's photo gallery and found what I expected to find. The most recent automatically captured image showed Trevor standing by his car, but it was clearly no longer Trevor. The figure in the photo was tall and dark and wrong, wearing Trevor's clothes, but possessing none of his humanity. And behind Sarah Beth, who was standing next to me at the window, a new figure had appeared. The same impossibly tall, dark presence that had stalked Leah and then Trevor. "It's moved on to you now," I told her quietly. Sarah Beth looked at the photo and started crying. We were down to 5 people, and the entity showed no signs of stopping its methodical hunt. If anything, it seemed to be getting more efficient. The time between its initial appearance behind someone and their eventual disappearance was getting shorter. "We have to do something," Chris said. "We can't just wait around for this thing to pick us off one by one." "Like what?" Meredith demanded. "How do you fight something that only exists in photographs?" "Maybe we can't fight it," Jamie said quietly, but maybe we can escape it. Her idea was simple but desperate. We would destroy all the cameras and phones in the cabin, making it impossible for any more photographs to be taken. Without photos, the entity would have no way to manifest or track us. It was worth a try. We gathered every device capable of taking pictures. Phones, tablets, even an old digital camera that Meredith found in one of the bedroom closets. Chris built up the fire in the living room fireplace, while I used a hammer to smash each device into non-functional pieces. The destruction felt like an act of vandalism, but also like an act of liberation. As each camera met its end, I felt some of the oppressive weight that had been building since the previous evening begin to lift. "That's everything," I announced, tossing the final handful of broken plastic and glass into the fire. For the first time in hours, we all began to relax. Without any means of capturing images, the entity would have no way to continue its hunt. We were safe, or so we thought. It was Sarah Beth who noticed the old Polaroid camera sitting on the mantelpiece. "Did anyone check that?" she asked, pointing to the vintage camera that had probably been sitting there for decades. We all turned to look at the forgotten device, a classic instant camera from the 1970s that had somehow escaped our notice during the destruction spree. It was the kind of camera that produced physical photographs that developed themselves, the kind that couldn't be deleted or digitally manipulated. "It's probably broken," Meredith said hopefully. "That thing has to be 40 years old." But Chris was already walking over to examine it. He picked up the camera and turned it over in his hands, checking the mechanisms. "It feels like it has film in it," he said, "and the battery indicator is showing green." "Don't," Jamie said urgently. "Don't take any pictures with that thing." But it was too late. Whether intentionally or accidentally, Chris had pressed the shutter button. The camera made a mechanical whirring sound, and a small white square began emerging from the front of the device. We all watched in horrified fascination as the Polaroid photograph slowly developed, the chemical process gradually revealing the image it contained. The photo showed our group standing in the living room, all of us looking toward the camera with expressions of fear and confusion. And standing directly behind Sarah Beth, its long arms reaching around her shoulders like an embrace, was the tall, dark figure. But this time, its face was clearly visible. It wasn't human. It had never been human. The features were sharp and angular, like something carved from shadow and obsidian. Its eyes were deep holes that seemed to extend infinitely inward, and its mouth was stretched in a smile that contained too many teeth. As we stared at the developing photograph, Sarah Beth began to change. It started with her face, which became blurred and indistinct, as if she were moving at high speed even though she was standing perfectly still. Her features began to smear and run like wet paint, and her eyes gradually darkened until they were the same lightless voids we'd seen in the photograph. "Sarah Beth?" Chris called out, reaching toward her, but the thing wearing Sarah Beth's clothes didn't respond. It simply stood there, swaying slightly, its face continuing to lose definition until it was nothing but a smooth, dark surface. Then it turned and walked out of the cabin. We followed it outside, but there was no trace of Sarah Beth or the entity that had replaced her. She had simply vanished into the Wisconsin woods, leaving behind no footprints, no broken branches, no sign that she had ever existed. The Polaroid photograph was still in Chris's trembling hands. As I watched, the image began to change. Sarah Beth's figure faded from the picture, leaving only empty space where she had been standing. And behind Jamie, who had been standing next to her, a new dark figure began to materialize. "It's you now," I told Jamie quietly. She looked at the photograph and nodded, tears streaming down her face. "How long do I have?" I didn't know how to answer that question. The entity's pattern seemed to be accelerating, and I had no idea what triggered the final moment when it replaced its target. "Maybe we can outrun it," Chris suggested desperately. "Get in the car and drive as far away as possible." But I had a terrible feeling that distance wouldn't matter. The entity wasn't bound by physical limitations. It existed in the spaces between reality and image, in the gap between what we saw and what cameras captured. "We need to understand what it wants," I said. "Why is it doing this? What's the purpose?" "Does it matter?" Meredith asked. "Our friends are gone, David. Leah, Trevor, Sarah Beth. They're all gone. And this thing is going to keep taking us one by one until there's nobody left." She was right, but I couldn't accept that there was nothing we could do. As a photographer, I'd spent years studying the relationship between reality and image, between what exists and what can be captured. There had to be some weakness in the entity's method, some flaw we could exploit. "The photographs," I said suddenly. "It needs the photographs to manifest. But what happens if we look at the images it creates?" "What do you mean?" Chris asked. "Every time we look at a photo with the entity in it, we're acknowledging its presence," I explained. "We're giving it reality by observing it. What if we just don't look?" It was a desperate theory, but it was all we had. I carefully turned the Polaroid photograph face down on the coffee table, making sure not to glance at the image again. "Nobody looks at that photo," I instructed. "Don't acknowledge what's in it, don't think about it, just pretend it doesn't exist." We spent the next hour in tense silence, all of us carefully avoiding looking at the turned-over photograph. Jamie sat in the corner of the room as far from the rest of us as possible, as if distance might somehow protect us from whatever was targeting her. But avoidance only worked for so long. The photograph began to move on its own, sliding across the coffee table until it was right side up again. The image seemed to glow with an inner light, drawing our attention despite our best efforts to ignore it. And in the photo, the figure behind Jamie was reaching out with one impossible arm, its shadow falling across her face like a death shroud. "I can feel it," Jamie whispered. "It's right behind me. I can feel its breath on my neck." Chris started to turn around to look behind her, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said. "If you look, you'll make it real." But Jamie was already changing. Her voice became distant and hollow, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. Her movements became slow and deliberate, like someone moving underwater. "It's so cold," she said, and her breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. "So cold and dark. I can't see." And then she was gone. Not disappeared like the others. Actually gone, as if she had never existed at all. The chair where she'd been sitting was empty, and when I looked at the Polaroid photograph, there was no trace of her in the image. Only the entity standing alone in the frame, its terrible smile wider than ever. Behind Chris, another shadow had begun to form. 4 of us left, Meredith said quietly. Chris looked at the photograph and saw his own doom staring back at him. The entity was positioned directly behind his chair, close enough that its long fingers appeared to be tangling in his hair. "I'm not going to wait around for this thing to take me," he said, standing up abruptly. "I'm going to end this." Before any of us could stop him, Chris had grabbed the Polaroid camera from the mantelpiece and was pointing it at himself. "If this thing needs photographs to exist, then I'm going to give it more than it can handle," he said. "Chris, don't!" Meredith shouted, but he was already pressing the shutter button. The camera whirred and clicked, and another white square began emerging from the front of the device. Chris took another photo, then another, rapidly clicking the shutter as many times as the camera would allow. Each photograph showed the same thing: Chris taking pictures of himself, with a tall, dark entity standing behind him in every shot. But something strange began happening to the images. Instead of showing the entity becoming more solid and defined, the photographs began to show it fragmenting. In some pictures, it appeared as multiple overlapping figures. In others, it was stretched and distorted, as if the rapid succession of images was somehow confusing its ability to manifest properly. "It's working," Chris said excitedly, looking at the developing Polaroids scattered around his feet. "Look, it can't maintain coherence if there are too many images at once." But his celebration was premature. As we watched, all the photographs began to merge together, the images flowing like liquid from one Polaroid to another. The scattered pieces of the entity reassembled themselves into a single, more solid presence that seemed to exist across all the images simultaneously. And Chris began to fade, not blur or distort like the others, but actually become transparent, as if he were losing substance. I could see through him to the wall behind, and his voice became increasingly faint as he tried to speak. "I can see them," he whispered, his words barely audible. "Leah and Trevor and Sarah Beth and Jamie, they're all here, trapped in the photographs. They're trying to tell me something." Then he was gone, leaving only empty air where he had been standing. The Polaroid photographs on the floor burst into flames, burning with an unnatural blue fire that left no ash behind. When the flames died away, there was nothing left but bare wooden floorboards. 3 of us remained. "We have to destroy it," Meredith said. "Whatever this thing is, wherever it comes from, we have to find a way to destroy it completely." "How?" I asked. "We don't even know what it is, let alone how to fight it." The cabin," she said suddenly. "This all started when we came to the cabin. Maybe it's tied to this place somehow." I looked around the living room, trying to see it with fresh eyes. The cabin felt normal, just an ordinary vacation home filled with ordinary furniture and decorations. But there was something about the atmosphere that had changed since we'd arrived. A subtle wrongness that I'd attributed to stress and fear, but might be something more fundamental. "There," Meredith said, pointing to a framed photograph hanging on the wall near the fireplace. It was an old black and white picture, probably taken decades ago, showing a group of people standing in front of the cabin. A family, by the look of it, parents and children, and what might have been grandparents, all dressed in the fashion of the 1950s or 1960s. But standing at the edge of the group, partially cut off by the frame of the photograph, was a tall, dark figure that looked disturbingly familiar. "It's been here all along," I said quietly. trapped in that photograph, waiting for someone to notice it. We approached the framed picture cautiously, as if it might attack us. Up close, the resemblance was unmistakable. The entity that had been stalking us was clearly visible in the old photograph, standing behind a young woman who might have been Meredith's grandmother. This is how it spreads, I realized. It gets photographed with one group of people, and then it waits for the next group to see the image. Once someone notices it, it becomes active. So we destroy the photograph, Meredith said, reaching for the frame. But as soon as her fingers touched the glass, something terrible happened. The photograph began to move, the static image becoming animated like a film. The people in the pictures started turning toward the camera, their faces blurring and distorting until they all bore the same featureless, void-like appearance as the entity. And behind me, I felt the unmistakable presence of something tall and cold and impossibly wrong. I turned around, and there it was. Not in a photograph this time, but standing directly in the cabin with us. The entity had finally manifested in physical reality, its full horror visible to the naked eye. It was even worse than the photographs had suggested. The thing stood nearly 9 feet tall, its body elongated and stretched like a shadow cast by a setting sun. Its skin was the deep black of absolute darkness, and its limbs moved with an unsettling fluidity that suggested they contained no bones or joints. But it was the face that was truly horrifying. What I had taken for a blur or distortion in the photographs was actually a constantly shifting surface, as if its features were trying to form but could never quite achieve coherence. The eyes were holes in reality itself, deeper than the deepest cave, and looking into them made my vision swim and my mind reel. The entity reached toward me with one impossible arm, and I could feel the cold radiating from its presence like the chill of deep space. Then Meredith did something unexpected. Instead of running or screaming, she grabbed a poker from the fireplace and swung it at the entity with all her strength. The iron rod passed right through the thing's body without meeting any resistance, but something strange happened. For just a moment, the entity flickered, becoming translucent, as if the act of trying to strike it had somehow weakened its hold on physical reality. "It's not fully here," she said breathlessly. "It's still partially trapped in the photographs." I understood immediately. The entity could manifest physically, but it was still dependent on the images that had given it life. Destroy the photographs, and we might be able to destroy it as well. I ran to the wall and grabbed the framed photograph of Meredith's family. The glass was ice cold under my fingers, and I could see frost forming on the surface as I lifted it from its hook. "Now what?" I asked. "The fire," Meredith said, gesturing toward the fireplace, where the remains of our destroyed phones and cameras were still smoldering. I hurled the framed photograph into the flames. The glass cracked with a sound like breaking ice, and the old paper began to curl and blacken around the edges. The entity let out a sound that was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite the howl of wind through empty spaces, but something in between that made every nerve in my body fire at once. As the photograph burned, the entity began to fade. Its solid form became translucent, then ghostly, then barely visible at all. But it wasn't going quietly. The temperature in the cabin dropped so rapidly that our breath began misting in the air. Ice formed on the windows, and I could hear the wooden beams creaking as the sudden cold made them contract. "It's fighting back," Meredith said through chattering teeth. But the photograph was almost completely consumed now, only a few charred fragments remaining in the fire. The entity made one final attempt to reach us, its long arms stretching across the room like elastic shadows, but its fingertips passed harmlessly through our bodies. Then, with a sound like air being sucked into a vacuum, it was gone. The warmth returned to the cabin immediately, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over us since the previous evening lifted like a fog, dissipating in sunlight. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe normally. "Is it over?" Meredith asked. I looked around the cabin, searching for any sign that the entity might still be present, but everything appeared normal. Just two exhausted people standing in an ordinary living room, surrounded by the debris of their desperate fight for survival. "I think so," I said. "I think it's really over. We spent the rest of the day searching the cabin for any other old photographs that might contain similar entities, but found nothing suspicious. The framed family picture seemed to have been the source of our particular nightmare. As evening approached, we decided to leave. Neither of us wanted to spend another night in the cabin, even if the immediate threat had been eliminated. We packed quickly and loaded our remaining belongings into my car, eager to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and the place where we'd lost 4 friends. But as we were driving away, I made the mistake of looking in the rearview mirror. In the reflection, I could see the cabin receding behind us, looking peaceful and innocent in the fading daylight. But there, standing on the front porch and watching our departure, was a tall, dark figure. I blinked and looked again, but the reflection showed only empty porch and darkening woods. "David," Meredith said quietly from the passenger seat, "did you bring your phone?" I checked my pocket, confused. "No, I thought we destroyed all the cameras." "Then how do you explain this?" She was holding up a smartphone I'd never seen before, its screen showing a photograph of our car driving away from the cabin. And in the back seat, clearly visible through the rear window, were 4 additional passengers: Leah, Trevor, Sarah Beth, and Chris. All of them looking directly at the camera with those same dark void-like eyes I'd come to know and fear. The phone slipped from Meredith's hands and clattered to the floor of the car. When I glanced down at it, the screen was black, showing nothing but our own terrified reflections. But I knew they were still there. Somewhere in the digital ether, in the spaces between pixels and memory, our friends had found a way to follow us, and they weren't alone. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've noticed photographs appearing on devices I've never seen before, images showing up in online galleries I never created, pictures of me going about my daily life, taken from impossible angles by unknown cameras. In every single image, standing just behind me or at the edge of the frame, is the tall, dark figure. Sometimes it's accompanied by others, shadowy forms that might once have been people, now transformed into something else entirely. I've stopped looking at photographs. I've covered all the cameras in my apartment, avoided mirrors, turned away from any reflective surface that might capture my image. But I know it's only a matter of time. Because the entity doesn't just live in photographs anymore. It lives in every device with a camera, every security system, every satellite image and traffic camera and doorbell cam. In a world where everything is constantly being photographed and recorded, there's nowhere left to hide. And late at night, when I'm lying in bed with all the lights off and all the cameras covered, I can sometimes hear them whispering to me from the darkness. Leah and Trevor and Sarah Beth and Chris and Meredith, all of them calling my name, telling me how much better it is on the other side, how much easier it would be to just give in and join them. The worst part is that I'm starting to believe them. So if you're reading this, if you've somehow found this account, please take my advice. Don't trust photographs. Don't assume that what you see in an image is really there, or that what you don't see is really absent. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at the background of pictures, because once you notice something that shouldn't be there, once you acknowledge its presence, it becomes real, and it never stops hunting. I can hear my phone buzzing now. New photographs arriving in albums I didn't create. I know I shouldn't look, but the curiosity is becoming overwhelming. Maybe it would be easier to just peek at one more image, just to see how close it's gotten, just to see what I'm going to become. Note, this document was found on the laptop of David Chen, a freelance photographer who disappeared from his Madison apartment on October 15th. Security footage from his building shows Mr. Chen leaving his apartment at 3:17 a.m., but he was never captured on any exterior cameras. His whereabouts remain unknown. Investigators did find several unusual photographs on his devices, showing what appears to be a tall, dark figure in various locations around the city. These images have been dismissed as digital artifacts or deliberate manipulations. No connection has been established between Mr. Chen's disappearance and the similar disappearances of Leah Morrison, Trevor Kowalski, Sarah Beth Patterson, Christopher Holland, and Jamie Rodriguez, all of whom vanished during the same weekend at a cabin in Wisconsin. The cabin in question was destroyed by fire 3 days after the disappearances. The cause of the fire remains under investigation. Anyone with information regarding the whereabouts of these individuals is asked to contact the Dane County Sheriff's Department.